In Africa, as elsewhere in the world, Russia has been largely defeated. Those were the words of the French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, the Africa Forward Summit 2026, and they have struck like a dagger to Russia's collective heart. Why? Because Barrot is right. Russia's last allies in the world are quickly becoming Putin's biggest problem. Influence is waning. Backs are being turned against Putin. If you still think that Russia is a global superpower, think again. The decline is real, and Africa showcases how far Russia has fallen. Barrot made his comments to Le Monde in the wake of the Africa Forward Summit 2026. That summit alone stands as a testament to what Barrot calls Russia's waning influence in Africa. It was co-hosted by France and Kenya in the Kenyan capital city of Nairobi, and it lasted for 2 days between May 11th and May 12th. Around 30 heads of state and governmental leaders attended the summit, along with several thousand business leaders, and the summit ultimately resulted in France pledging a staggering 14 billion euros, or around $16.2 billion, of investment into various projects. That investment highlights a key difference between France's approach to Africa and Putin's attempts to build Russia's influence, but we'll get back to that. What this summit highlights is that the tensions that have been simmering between France and many of the Sahel nations in Africa, along with some of the French-speaking countries on the continent, are starting to cool. Barrot himself points to the fact that people from the Ivory Coast attended the summit, suggesting a thawing. However, to explain why all of this matters, especially to Russia, we first need to explore what Putin has been trying to do in Africa over the last few years. Russia's goal has been to win in Africa at the expense of France and the rest of Europe. Now those plans are falling apart. Not that Putin would have ever predicted Russia's fall from grace on the continent when he first began his campaign of influence. That campaign began in the Sahel region of Africa, which covers much of the western and north-central parts of the continent and roughly stretches from Senegal to Sudan. Russia entered that region amidst Putin's larger efforts to reassert Russia as the sort of global influence that it had been during the glory days of the Soviet Union. Between 2014 and 2019, we saw those efforts accelerate. The illegal annexation of Crimea allowed Putin to claim that he was somehow returning Russian territory to the motherland. Russian campaigns in Syria, Libya, and the Central African Republic all helped Russia to build what Putin likely viewed as a network of puppets and proxies that he will be able to use to Russia's advantage in the future. The strategy was almost always the same. Putin would identify an African nation dealing with instability of some kind, and he would ride in on the Russian white horse to offer stability in the form of security and weapons. The Sahel was the perfect victim for Putin's campaign. By the end of the 2010s, the entire region was embroiled in issues related to crumbling political entities and broad security challenges. Corruption was rife in many Sahel nations, and violence was on the rise. Military juntas in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso all took power between 2020 and 2023. In Mali, Putin saw an opportunity as he offered up Russian mercenaries and later a dedicated Russian force to protect the junta that had come to power. That was the pattern. Find somebody to back and build influence by offering soldiers and security. Keep Mali in mind, by the way. That nation, perhaps more than any other, showcases the very real problem that Russia now faces in Africa. Putin's strategy worked for a while, and when Russia's leader invaded Ukraine, he ramped up his campaign of influence. Putin didn't realize at the time that the invasion would end up being the rod that broke Russia's back. For the first couple of years, nobody could see Russia's failure coming. In 2023, the BBC reported that a massive disinformation campaign was ongoing in Africa. Built on a large social network that was informally dubbed the Russosphere, the campaign delivered all of the messaging that Putin believed would weaken European influence in Africa while strengthening Russia's hold over the nations into which its tendrils had slid. France was accused of modern-day colonialism, stirring up the sorts of tensions between France and the Sahel nations that we mentioned earlier. Ukrainians were decried as Nazis and Satanists as Russia attempted to create support for Putin's invasion that would later manifest in the exploitation of African manpower. Mercenary groups such as Wagner started to make their presence felt, particularly in countries like Mali. And all of this was underpinned by Russia positioning itself as the security partner of choice for many of the African nations that it was trying to woo. In a June 2024 piece, The Independent even discussed why so many nations were turning to Russia over the West. It pointed toward repeated visits made by Russian politicians, the use of the likes of Wagner, and the creation of Russia's Africa Corps, all of which intended to send a message to African nations: the West doesn't care about you. But Russia will provide you with security, soldiers, and direct lines to the most powerful people in Russian politics. Russia was also smart in that it didn't overly meddle in the domestic affairs of the nations that it was courting. Where the US and other Western nations pushed democracy, especially in countries that were falling under the influence of dictators or juntas, Russia kept an outwardly hands-off approach. Of course, Russia was still influencing these countries, but it was doing so behind closed doors, with everything presented to the public, making it appear that Russia was simply supporting African nations, many of which just so happened to be rich in oil, minerals, and other resources, down whatever paths those nations wanted to take. Putin was the benevolent leader. The West wanted to force change. Go with Russia and your security and ability to govern yourself would be guaranteed. The messaging may have been on point, but the problem that Putin never foresaw is what has led Russia into the failure that it now faces. Promises of security only mean so much when you fail to deliver, and that, along with several other factors, is what is leading to Russia's last few allies to turn their backs on Putin. That changes everything for Russia's geopolitical influence. But before we dig deeper, this is why we make the Military Show, to explain how power really moves. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss out on what's coming next. So Putin had spent years building up Russia's influence in Africa. Now it's all crumbling down, and there are several reasons why. First up is investment in the African continent. In his interview with Le Monde, Barrow reveals the major vulnerability in Putin's plan, which is that Russia doesn't spend anything close to what it needs to spend to gain true influence. We often focus too much on surface issues, but the reality is clear, Barrow declared, adding, "In terms of trade, investment, and welcoming African students to our universities, France and Europe's contribution to Africa's development is 10, 50, even 100 times greater than that of countries such as China, Russia, or the US." The European Council on Foreign Relations backs and builds on this statement in an October 2024 piece. It pointed out that Russian trade with African nations had doubled in the decade up to 2023, reaching $24.6 billion in 2023. However, that was still a long way behind trade with the European Union, which was $288 billion. China, India, and Turkey were also well ahead of Russia on the trade front and still are. At the time, Russian direct foreign investment also accounted for just 1% of Africa's total, and it didn't deliver on the scale needed to fund projects that could enact actual change, such as the development of large infrastructure or the creation of mining projects that might allow African nations to benefit from their resource-rich land. These financial issues were bubbling away under the surface, but the cracks that have started to appear were all papered over by Russia's security promises. The anti-West sentiment that Putin had successfully spread in many nations worked for as long as Russia wasn't called upon to deliver on those promises. Spoiler alert, Russia was called to deliver on its promises, and it failed spectacularly. Earlier we asked you to keep Mali in mind. There was a reason for that. Recent events in Mali have exposed Russia's promises to be completely false. Putin's forces in the nation were supposed to help Mali's junta maintain control over the population. But when put to the test, they failed so badly that they allowed separatists and rebels to make massive gains in Mali. Toward the end of April, Mali's Azawad Liberation Front, which is the militia that is fighting for the independence of northern Mali from the central junta, launched an assault on the city of Kidal. A key stronghold, that city was home to several units of Russia's Africa Corps, which were put in place solely to stop such an attack in its tracks. They failed. The Africa Corps was surrounded in Kidal and eventually negotiated its withdrawal. The Hill reports that the withdrawal appeared to grow to encompass most of northern Mali, or around half of the territory that the Africa Corps was supposed to be protecting. That on its own would have been humiliating enough for Russia's protectors, but making things even worse was that footage emerged of a Russian convoy getting out of Kidal as fast as possible, highlighting Russia's failure. It later emerged that the Africa Corps had withdrawn so quickly that it had left equipment behind, including mine-resistant vehicles that are now in the hands of rebels that have the backing of Al-Qaeda. Such attacks destroy the narrative of Russia offering security. They could also give rise to further rebellions in places like Burkina Faso and Niger, where the Africa Corps, which has just proven itself to be useless at the one job it's supposed to do, has stationed units. This single incident is indicative of a wider problem that Russia has created for itself across the Sahel region. As Foreign Affairs noted in a March 25th piece, a combination of Russian heavy-handedness and its inability to convert the gains made through its campaign of influence into any real successes has crippled Putin in the Sahel. Russia hasn't fostered any cooperation between Sahelian states, which means it's done practically nothing to solve the stability problems that it claimed it would help those states to solve. If anything, Russia has created more division in Africa. The Kremlin celebrated when Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali withdrew from the Economic Community of West African States to form the Alliance of Sahel States as a new economic bloc in the region. But cheering didn't amount to any sort of real economic support, as we mentioned earlier. It's thoughts and prayers when money and resources are what those states need from Russia. And as other players enter the Sahel field and Africa in general, Russia is also finding its influence diluting. Europe, and especially France, already has influence and is rebuilding bridges. China, Turkey, and even the United Arab Emirates are building ties, all of which undercut what Putin is trying to do in the African states, where Russia tried to create more global power. In short, it's all falling apart for Putin in Africa. The Kremlin's militarized approach is losing out to France and Europe's long-term economic model. Barrow makes that point, telling Le Monde, "Beyond security issues, Russia's contribution to development of Africa is zero. France's trade with Africa is 3 times greater than Russia's. French investment is 8 to 10 times higher. The number of African students welcomed in French universities is 8 times higher. The numbers speak for themselves." He's backed by a May 15th piece by the Lansing Institute, which points to the Ukraine war as being the trigger for Putin losing so much of his influence. That point makes a lot of sense. Russia's entire strategy in Ukraine was to steamroll through and prove the power of Russia's military while taking what the Kremlin saw as a weak state. Over 4 years later, Russia has only managed to claim about 20% of Ukraine, and it will likely have to keep fighting for many more years to take the entire country. In the process, until tens of thousands of units of Russian military equipment have been destroyed, along with about 1.35 million soldiers and counting, all of which means that Russia doesn't have the financial or military resources to provide the sort of support that it promised to its African allies just a few short years ago. Russia has been reduced to providing mercenaries to gain access to African gold and diamond mines. And what happened in Mali proved that those mercenaries aren't exactly competent at their jobs. That mention of mines leads us to another reason why Russia is now losing in Africa just as badly as it's losing in Ukraine. Russia's entire strategy wasn't built around wanting to help African nations grow so that all can prosper from the resources on their land. Putin wanted to exploit, to provide surface-level protection that would never have to be tested, allowing him to spread Russian influence and gain access to what he really wants out of Africa: resources, both material and human. The exploitation has been present from the start, though Russia was able to conceal it with propaganda. When Putin expanded Russian outreach into Africa in the 2010s, that was exploitative in its own right. Only Putin was exploiting weak regimes and political instability to burrow Russian influence into vulnerable African states. It was a cheap and quick tactic that, like so much of what Russia does and says, didn't hold up to scrutiny. Now, and as Barrow points out, all that Russia is able to offer is exploitation in return for security services that fail when they're tested. "What I see is that Vladimir Putin's Russia offers nothing but security services traded for exploitation of Africa's resources. And lately, in Africa as elsewhere, in Mali, but also from Venezuela to Iran and Syria, Russia has been largely defeated," Barrow tells Le Monde. Again, he has a point. It's not just the failure of the Africa Corps that will be catching the attention of the African allies that Putin has lured in with promises of protection. Those allies will have watched what happened in Syria, where Bashar al-Assad's entire regime was toppled with lightning-fast efficiency, despite having been supported by Russia for years. They will see what happened in Iran, where Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed within the first 24 hours of Operation Epic Fury as Russian air defenses failed to protect him. In Venezuela, former dictator Nicolas Maduro was snatched up by the US in an operation that made the military hardware that Russia had been sending to the former president look practically useless. Time and time again, the pattern emerges. Russia promises protection, then it fails to protect. Mali was just the first example that has really affected the African states where Russia holds influence, and it's unlikely to be the last. And it's not just the pattern of protection failures that African nations are starting to see. The exploitation that is rife from Russia is showing those nations that any deal they make with Putin only really benefits Russia and can actively harm Africa. Between the beginning of the Ukraine war and February 2024, Russia extracted $2.5 billion worth of gold from Africa, all of which was likely used to fund the war. The Wagner Group, which has essentially morphed into the Africa Corps, was key to this extraction. In Mali, Russia wants to get its hands on uranium and lithium. Elsewhere in Africa, Russia is running recruitment campaigns laden with disinformation and deception to convince young African men to sign up for the Russian army and fight in Ukraine. Many of these men don't know what they're really signing up for. They're promised rear duty and fast access to visas, new lives in Russia. But what really happens to them is that they're shipped to the front to serve as little more than meat for Putin's war. Ukraine said in February that its data had revealed that there were more than 1,780 citizens from African countries fighting for Russia. Putin and his cronies deny all of it, of course. But it's clear that the exploitation that has always been on Putin's mind now extends to Africa's people. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is creating the sort of blowback that could topple a house of cards that was already missing half the deck. The American Foreign Policy Council points out that African leaders are starting to speak out against Russia. Nigeria's foreign ministry is actively warning the country's citizens not to sign up for a foreign military. In South Africa, officials have received panicked phone calls from citizens who end up trapped among Russian mercenary groups as they fought their way into the Donbas region of Ukraine. The new pattern has emerged. Russia is stealing everything that it can from Africa while it still has the chance. If Putin and his Kremlin cronies were able to offer the security and protection that they have promised to their partners in return for this exploitation, then eyes may have been diverted and Russia's actions could have been overlooked. But that's not what's happening. There's no real protection coming from Russia. There's almost no money, especially when compared to what Europe and China pour into Africa. All that exists now is exploitation. Russia's most recent allies are waking up to that fact and they're starting to turn. The protection myth has been shattered and Putin has been exposed. What we now see is the collapse of Russia's influence on a continent that Putin believes to be invaluable. After all, why would an African nation want to work with Russia now after seeing all that's happened? That's Barrow's point, as all that Russia has managed to achieve is reopening the door for Europe to become the key geopolitical player in Africa. We touched on the Mali incident and why it's so important to the fate of Russia and its campaign of influence in Africa. If you want to know more about that incident and what it really means for Russia, then check out our video. And if you found this video interesting, make sure you subscribe to The Military Show, where we cover how power really moves, along with all of the incidents that prove that Putin and his cronies aren't as powerful as they want you to believe. And thank you as always for watching.